Chapter 7. Living the Dream. The sun was just starting to rise, and already you could tell it was going to be another hot and humid day in the state of Virginia. Well, it was late July when the climate could easily reach subtropical temperatures. Tucked away in the middle of a field of parched grasslands, an old renovated farmhouse had all of its upstairs attic windows open, trying to dispel the heat. This rural place at Farr's Corner, 227700 Wallace Road, had been bought by the ex-FBI agent when he'd been forced into hiding. Fox Mulder and his partner Dana Scully had gone on the run after his narrow escape from a military prison. Certain government officials, some of whom were alien replacements, had set a trap at the Mount Weather military facility in Bluemont. After being involved in a fight which resulted in a fatality, he was accused of murdering an old army buddy of John Duggart's, Noel Raw, who later turned out to be yet another super soldier. Their aim was to be rid of the paranormal investigator once and for all by declaring a guilty verdict, with the outcome being a death sentence. However, once he escaped and managed to disappear from under their radar, things quietened down and they ceased looking for him. They probably decided that at least with him losing his position in the Bureau, he would be less of a threat, since he no longer had access to the resources he required to uncover any more of their plans. The X-Files was closed down and indeed completely forgotten about for a fair number of years, gathering dust in the basement of the federal building in Washington. The rundown house was purchased so Mulder could literally be free from a life he'd spent chasing the paranormal whilst being duped at every turn. He didn't have the energy or indeed the money to get it completely restored, so when Scully visited him on occasion, she started calling it the Unremarkable House, which later became their pet name for it. One time she made a house call. This had resulted in him being thrown back into a case unofficially because a female FBI agent had gone missing. Unbelievable. These assholes had ruined his career, then had the absolute nerve to ask him for his help. This, of course, threw him into a precarious situation where he became immersed in a Frankenstein nightmare and almost lost his life again. After that horrendous experience, he seriously felt he was done with the whole paranormal crap for good. Even Scully kept on telling him it was consuming him and that she herself couldn't take it anymore. The problem was, it had been his life for so long, he was at a loss with how he was going to spend the rest of it. This, unfortunately, had resulted in him slipping into a deep depression. Even though his partner stood by him for a while, in the end he told her the wisest decision would be to just get away from him, as he couldn't stand what it was doing to her. Why on earth should she put up with this while he fell apart at the seams? At first she'd refused to leave and had stood by him as long as she could, but having a high-pressure job as a neurological doctor, as well as trying to take care of her long-suffering partner, it all just proved too much for her to handle, so she walked away. It was her change of heart which eventually forced him to pull himself together and seek the help he needed. Finally, taking Scully's advice, he went on an intense therapy session, which basically changed his life. He discovered he could cope and was doing quite well, even without her presence. But deep in his heart he missed her so much, and even though they stayed in touch with emails and phone calls, it just wasn't enough. Then along came something he couldn't have predicted in a million years. The big turnaround when a web TV show host contacted Skinner at the FBI. The man had been convinced he'd uncovered information about a government conspiracy, which resulted in blowing Mulder's previous beliefs about the existence of ETs right out of the water. So, determined to prove his own theories right, he went back to the FBI investigating paranormal cases once more, and all previous grievances were forgotten about on their part. Not that the feeling was mutual, but his deep-seated obsession to uncover the truth had always been a major part of him. In the end, it was that which made his mind up to return to the investigating he left behind. To be honest, being back in the driving seat also gave him one hell of a buzz. It had felt good to stretch old muscles and pick up where he left off. The biggest rush of all, though, was being reassigned with his red-headed partner. Even though the years had flown by, their respect and devotion for each other had remained constant throughout. In fact, you could have said it had almost been like old times, disagreeing and agreeing with each other like nothing had changed. That is until he discovered former members of the original syndicate were now working in the private sector with insidious plans of their own. This cartel, along with other underhanded ideas, were intending to upload everyone's mind into a cloud-based digital afterlife to escape from an end-of-the-world scenario. The biggest kick in the teeth was learning that it was his own father and arch-nemesis, Carl Gerhard Busch, aka the Smoking Man, who had set this plan in motion since the Roswell crash in 1947. To create a pathogen using alien technology that would essentially wipe out most of humanity, barring a select group with alien DNA in their genetic makeup. He had tried everything in his power to stop it, and succeeded in finally disposing of the man once and for all. After firing a round of bullets into his chest, then pushing him off a dock outside an abandoned sugar factory in Norfolk, committing his body to a watery grave. Whilst trying to prevent mass genocide from taking place on Earth, and relying on what seemed to be hallucinations his partner kept having about an alternative future, which also revealed his own demise was on the cards, Mulder was somehow reunited with his long-lost son, William, who through a form of telekinesis had been sharing visions of how it would all end with his birth mother, Dana Scully. Only tragically it turned out the boy had been nothing but an experiment by his sick, twisted father, who many years ago had artificially inseminated Scully's womb with a combination of human sperm and alien DNA. The black-lunged son of a bitch had chosen her to be the vessel that would carry his creation to term. That revelation had absolutely devastated Mulder, as deep in his heart he believed he'd been the boy's biological father. After William decided he did not want to be the one to aid his real parent in destroying humanity and would rather die, he chose to shapeshift into Fox's image and urged the Smoking Man to kill him. After witnessing the execution, a clear gunshot to the head, Mulder returned the favour with no remorse whatsoever, riddling the evil bastard with bullets from his own pistol. But after an amazing twist of fate, the impossible happened yet again, when only minutes later Scully told him she was pregnant with his child. The shock had been overwhelming at first, yet it turned out to be a small miracle. One they discovered in time was the answer to their prayers, as well as a life-changing experience. The sound of birdsong outside the attic bedroom window awoke Fox Mulder from his deep slumber. Opening his eyes, he blinked a couple of times, unaware of his present surroundings at first. Boy, that had been one hell of a dream, almost an out-of-body experience, and to be honest, it had thrown him off kilter slightly. Finding his bearings, he realised he was lying in the large double bed in his home. As vision adjusted even more, he could tell from the shadows on the ceiling and the rays of light starting to filter through the curtains that it was dawn. He heard a soft sigh beside him, causing him to turn around, only to discover the one woman who had lived through the nightmares with him for many years. Back in 1993, she'd been assigned to debunk his work on the X-Files, but over time had come around to listen and even believe in some of his crazy theories, eventually becoming his closest ally, his 1 in 5 billion. Gazing at Scully's naked sleeping form half covered by a sheet, he smiled as happier memories took shape in his mind. They had miraculously been blessed with a little bundle of joy of their own. Yes, it had defied all rational belief and never been explained in any shape or form, but what the hell? He now had a beautiful, healthy baby daughter, and that was something he would always be grateful for. They had been through so much pain and heartache, it was almost like a higher power had decided enough was enough, that they could finally have the life that had been so out of reach, and which, to be fair, they deserved. During her 9 months of pregnancy, Scully had moved back into his home, a decision they both came to in the end. They formed a bond that was stronger than ever and realised the love they had for each other had never gone away. It had only been put on hold while they'd tackled being back in the FBI. In fact, in the middle of one of their strange cases involving doppelgangers, they had ended up sleeping with each other again. For comfort more than anything, but Mulder had to admit at the time something had felt really right during those hours of intense bliss. Who could have possibly known it would result in them finally being able to have a family of their own? So he'd ended up quitting the Bureau for good and leaving behind his paranormal pursuits. He seriously never thought he would have the guts to walk away from something he'd been engrossed in for many years, but the main reason he'd opened the X-Files division in the first place was because of his ongoing obsession to find his lost sister, who he believed had been abducted by aliens. Only that had been resolved, and now, sadly, she was dead. There had been no real reason for resuming his work in the FBI, other than that secret desire to pursue unexplained cases, but since the birth of his baby girl, he'd decided his priorities had to change. Scully also chose to resign. Apart from being pregnant, she had a serious desire to get back to her working life in medicine at the Our Ladies of Sorrow Hospital. Truth is, he knew she lost interest in chasing monsters in the dark way before he did. So finally made the move and left his work as an agent behind forever. He came to the conclusion he no longer wanted to be consumed by the darkness either. Besides, he had much more important things to concentrate on now: his family. Not long after the decision to quit, he went ahead and booked a table at a very fine restaurant in Washington, not his usual preference, which tended to be fast food diners. After getting down on one knee, he proposed to Miss Dana Catherine Scully right there and then. To be absolutely honest, he'd been pretty damn nervous, but so relieved when she'd said yes, after being pleasantly shocked by his romantic gesture. After everything that had happened in the past, especially his complete breakdown which resulted in her leaving him, not knowing then if she'd ever come back, Mulder had been hoping that since their brief return to the FBI and dealing with yet more terrifying situations together, that she would have had a change of heart. She had been living with him for a year before he took the plunge and asked her to be his wife. In that time they'd become a couple once again, sharing each other's problems and spending nights making love. Not because each needed comfort after a frightening ordeal. No, this was pure, genuine, and let's not forget the passionate and intense part. He had known then that this was the woman he was going to spend the rest of his life, no, scratch that, the rest of eternity with. She stirred from her slumber and immediately felt his gaze upon her. "Hey, you," Scully said sweetly, nuzzling up to him. "Hi, sleepyhead," Mulder replied, lightly brushing his lips against her own. Returning the gesture, she felt his arms enfolding her, so deepened the kiss. For a good while they remained there, lost in complete contentment. Scully had to admit she couldn't remember a time when being with him had ever felt this good. Sure, they'd had moments of bliss, but nothing, it seemed, that would develop into a more permanent relationship. Right now it felt like a little piece of heaven, a beautiful romantic paradise just for the two of them. "How did we end up here?" she asked dreamily, gazing into his hazel eyes. "I don't know. Maybe all the crazy paths we went down finally brought us to the right destination," he replied with a smile. "You mean we took that road less travelled by?" she asked with a grin. "Something like that." He kissed her again. "We took a chance, and this time it paid off, my love." "It sure did," she agreed, then gave him a mischievous wink. "What say we cement our bonds more, Mr. Mulder?" "Never thought you'd ask, Mrs. Mulder," he replied with a smirk. His fingers began to stroke her long auburn hair, then softly trailed down her back, which made her shudder with delight. Cupping her hands around his face, she moved forward to kiss him passionately. Mulder groaned softly into her mouth, tongue intertwining with hers, as he pulled her into a strong embrace. Feeling a stirring deep within his loins, he knew he was ready to take this woman to the highest sexual peak of ecstasy she would ever experience in her goddamn life. Well, that was the idea at any rate, until the baby monitor on the side table decided to have its own plans. A distressed crying sound emitted from the little device, causing all ideas of impassioned, burning and red-hot desire to cease. "Oh, nuts!" Scully exclaimed. Reluctantly untangling herself from his embrace, she swiftly got to her feet and threw on a robe. "Guess it's my turn, huh?" "Yep," he replied, a little disgruntled. "Afraid you're the one with the breasts, hon. Beautiful as they are, I guess Catherine needs them more than me right now." Scully giggled, then leaned down and kissed him lightly. "They're all yours after she's been fed. Promise." "I'll hold you to that," he teased. Watching her leave the room to attend to their baby girl, he was surprised to feel a sudden sense of loss. But that was an absurd emotion to experience under the circumstances. She was only going to be next door. But for some reason he really didn't want to let her out of his sight, not even for a second. Only why exactly? What did he think was going to happen? That everything in his life would suddenly disappear as if it never existed? "You're being a bloody idiot, Mulder," he told himself harshly. "I mean, let's face it, he had everything he could have ever wished for. A life he once thought he could never be a part of under any circumstances. A beautiful wife, not only that, but someone who was his closest companion, his perfect other. Now with a precious child of their own, his sweet little Catherine. After she'd been born, they'd tied the knot and had a beautiful July wedding. It had been so enchanting, and William had been his best man." He stopped short, a puzzling look on his face. No, that can't be right, as he was dead. He had watched his father shoot him at point-blank range after the boy had morphed into his own image on that dock in Norfolk. Mulder started to feel uneasy and began shaking his head. That couldn't have actually happened, though, could it? He'd remembered the boy handing him the gold band which he placed on Scully's finger as a minister took them through their vows. So why on earth was he having conflicting memories of two different events? Only one could be the correct one, right? As he looked around the room at his surroundings, he chided himself for being ridiculous. The other incident, the one where he'd seen his son murdered, shot in the head by the smoking man, dear Dad, that had just been a nightmare, surely. There was only one way to find out. Leaning over the bed, he opened the desk drawer by his side and retrieved an address book. Searching for the page labelled W, he traced his finger down it and found the name, William Mulder, the surname having been crossed out with one large black pencil line. Without pondering on that, he grabbed his cell phone and dialed the number he'd found. "Hello?" The voice sounded sleepy. "Hi," he paused. "William?" The reply he got was not what he'd been expecting. "Fox, hey there, how's life with the missus?" Great," he replied, a little thrown off balance. "How are you, William?" "Oh, can't complain," he replied, then chuckled. "Since when did you get so formal? It's Will." "Sorry, Will," Mulder said, still perplexed. A brief silence followed. Mulder's first thought was that he'd cut him off, because the man he'd been talking to had lost his marbles. He certainly wasn't expecting to hear the next words that came out of the boy's mouth. "So I got the job. I'm now a fully fledged FBI agent like you used to be," he announced delightedly. "Sorry, you're a what?" He couldn't hide the astonishment in his own voice. "You joined the Bureau?" The voice on the other end of the phone sounded rather surprised. "Sure I did, following in my old man's footsteps, like I said I would." A warm feeling washed over him as he heard the words, "old man." So this was his son? Feeling a little tongue-tied, he managed to stumble out, "I'm proud of you." "Oh, thanks, Dad." Mulder felt like he was going to cry, so chose to respond with humour instead. "Just tell me you're not working on the X-Files," he teased. "The what?" was the reply. "Never mind," Mulder said. "It's not important." He realised what he'd just uttered and frowned. Never thought he'd see the day when he'd dismiss his previous life's work so lightly. "Hey, Kristen's arrived. I gotta go." "Kristen?" Mulder asked, confused all over again. "My girlfriend?" William answered, sounding baffled. "We were at your wedding, Dad." Yes, of course you were," Mulder replied. Trying to concentrate on the moment which was supposed to have been the happiest time of his life, he pictured a scene at the Hilton Hotel in Norfolk. "Oh no, we're back to that place again," he thought. Only this time it wasn't a dock beside any factory, but a ballroom full of light, laughter and music. He was dancing with Scully in his arms while a band played Italian composer Carmen Lombardo's beautifully haunting song, Return to Me. He was dressed in a black tuxedo with a white carnation in the top buttonhole of his jacket. She was in a low-cut silver sequin gown which sparkled like diamonds. It took his breath away just imagining her in such a garment. Folk were moving to the melodic strains of violins combined with the soft mellow tones from a grand piano, two of whom were his son William, also in the same coloured tux, and his girlfriend who was in a knee-length pale blue satin dress. "Hey, Dad," he heard a voice say, which brought him back to the present. "I'll talk soon, okay?" "Sure, son. Take care." Mulder put down the phone, then lay back against the bedhead. Closing his eyes, he tried to assess what had just taken place. He'd just had a conversation with his son William, and everything had sounded so completely normal. Yet in another life, the boy had been murdered in cold blood. If that wasn't enough to add insult to injury, he wasn't even his father. Then it struck him. There had been another time, or life, when someone else he knew had died. Mulder immediately opened his eyes and sat upright in the bed as the memories shaped themselves. The man had been an informant of his when he'd been in the bureau. He'd been involved in something called purity control, the black cancer. His life had also ended with a gunshot wound only to the chest. However, this same individual had also mysteriously appeared in his house and explained to him how a well-placed bullet had changed the course of his life, Deep Throat, who he later came to know as Ronald Pakula when he saw his name etched on a gravestone. It was a different house Mulder had been living in then, quite idyllic really, with a luscious green lawn. His sister had also been alive, a grown young woman with kids of her own living across the street from him. His father came to mind. That bastard had also resided in the same area, and even invited him and the woman he was living with for dinner. Only it hadn't been Scully, but someone else from his past who he'd had relations with. He pictured her wearing a long black lacy nightgown in a dim-lit bedroom as he took her into his arms, after she unlocked the cuffs he'd been wearing, Diana Fowley. They'd made love one night, but it had all seemed rather surreal. In the span of a heartbeat, he'd witnessed her pregnant, then kids running about the place, finally gazing down at an older version of herself dead in a coffin. Time had flown by at an abnormal rate, and he himself had aged and was nearing the end of his life. He'd been lying down in a bed whilst his son-of-a-bitch father spoke to him, only he hadn't gotten any older and was telling him to let go, that they were the last and others were waiting for him. The word apocalypse and end of the world came into his mind, and Mulder shuddered. He'd been forced to leave that scenario and had woken to find Scully crying whilst releasing him from metal bonds. He'd been strapped to a table in the shape of a cross where men had been operating on him. Mulder recoiled in horror when he remembered the reason why. They had drilled into his head to remove genetic material, which had then been transferred into his father's sick, twisted brain. It had been alien DNA. Had the ideal world he'd found himself in with Diana been a complete lie? A construct created in his own mind, replacing the fact he was dying? What if Scully hadn't come to his rescue? Would he have remained in domestic bliss with a previous lover if he'd been killed in his own lifetime? Living in that perfect parallel existence before time sped up? Or would he simply have ceased to exist? Suddenly Mulder grew pale and began to feel very uneasy. The life he was living now with Scully had been a dream come true. Proposing in the restaurant and her saying yes, the fairy tale wedding they'd had, not to mention the fact his son William was alive and well. Come to think of it, he'd left a life of chasing the paranormal behind, choosing instead to settle down with a wife and child. To what? Spend their days in perfect harmony? And then they were going to live happily ever after like Walt Disney characters in some romantic storybook ending. It was all just a little too good to be true, especially for him of all people. The man who had spent his days endlessly pursuing supernatural forces, constantly being deceived at every turn, who had lost loved ones and suffered so much pain and heartache. Why would his life now become this perfect, idealistic, magical existence filled with complete tranquility? A troubling question entered his mind. Mulder was surprised it had, since this was something he hadn't considered since his abduction in Belfleur, Oregon, over 20-something years ago, when those blasted creatures from outer space had decided to return him in a very sorry state indeed. So why in all that was holy was it bothering him now? Maybe because after all these years he still hadn't been given a full explanation. How come after his miraculous resurrection did he then heal so amazingly fast? Oh, for fuck's sake, Mulder, he scolded himself. Just stop this, or you're going to go insane again. He stressed the last word strongly. Just then the door opened and he gazed at the beauty standing there before him. Scully, he gasped, all crazy thoughts now locked away in the back of his mind for the time being. Sorry, hon, it took a while to get her back to sleep, she confessed. Walking over to the bed, she removed her dressing gown, which she discarded on the floor. Now, where were we? She purred softly, snuggling up to him under the sheets. From that moment on, he was lost. In her eyes, her scent, her taste, everything proved right there and then, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that she was as real as the morning sun now shining through his bedroom window. As Mulder affectionately caressed her gently and kissed her mouth with such devotion, all thoughts of being trapped in the twilight zone evaporated back into the mists of time.